I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the emerging markets rout. Across the world, emergency meetings, rates hikes and currencies under pressure. Are we seeing an unravelling of the new world order? But we'll also show why not all emerging market crises are the same. From Argentina, a serially mismanaged economy, to Turkey, where a corruption scandal has opened old wounds, we talk to the country's finance minister. And amongst all the economic turmoil, an economy going from strength to strength, but not all benefits in the Philippines are trickling down to the poorest just yet. We talked about this towards the end of last year, and lo and behold, it's all started to come true. Emerging economies, the darlings of the global economy during these tough times, are now finding out that the bigger the up, the steeper the down. The short story is that a number of global currencies have been routed this past week, triggered in part by the US Federal Reserve pulling back on its stimulus program. In fact, this week the US lopped another $10 billion off that, bringing it down to $60 billion a month, a 25% reduction from its peak. And here's what that did. A bunch of countries raised interest rates, trying to stabilize their economies. Turkey, the most aggressive, with a 4.25% hike up to 12%. South Africa went up 0.5% to 5%. India surprised with a 0.25% increase as it tries to battle inflation. And Argentina, well, the peso's fallen so badly against the dollar that they've used up 20% of their foreign reserves in just a month, trying to shore up the currency. What we want to show you this week, though, is while we have this umbrella term, if you like, of emerging markets, that each is different. They have their own particular issues. South Africa, for example, struggled to create jobs. India, as we mentioned, battling inflation, and it's failed to open up to international investors. Argentina's economy, just been mismanaged, really. And then there is Turkey, a country that's been living beyond its means. Because while parts of the world suffered from the North Atlantic financial crisis, money flooded into Turkey, covering up the cracks with something that resembled a boom. Throw a political corruption scandal in too, and Turkey's actually got some problems. Anita McNaught puts all of this in context for us.
Turkey's currency, the lira, has been sliding for months, finally reaching historic lows against the US dollar. Businesses and institutions in Turkey holding foreign debt or trying to buy materials in foreign currency are hurting. The economy and employment are both under pressure. Financial analysts say the weakness was partly exposed by the Gezi protests of May-June 2013 and made far worse by the government-linked corruption scandals of December 2013. Finally, on the night of 28th of January, the Turkish central bank raised interest rates. It was what almost every analyst said Turkey had to do. Still, the Turkish lira is not yet recovered. Turkey is now part of an economic group known as the Fragile Five. With the US Federal Reserve sticking to its timetable for reducing its economic stimulus, financial analysts say Turkey should have been better prepared for the slowdown. The Turkish economy boomed with the arrival of international hot money, seeking a new home when Western economies slowed. A lot of it went into construction. Now a lot of it may be leaving. Turkey may have had no choice but to raise interest rates, but this measure will depress the domestic economy, making it harder to borrow locally. One way or another, the boom times in Turkey look like they're coming to an end.
So, Anita McNaught giving us the background there, but who better to give us more insight into how the Turkish economy is actually dealing with all this than the Turkish finance minister himself. Mehmet Simsek is joining us from Ankara. Minister, we thank you for your time. I guess you would say that the underlying Turkish economy is still in good strength and that it's doing well. However, when you get these horrible headlines, falling currencies, rising interest rates, what does that do to your economy? How do you deal with what is essentially a shock factor right now?
We had years of relatively easy money and currency has strength. Now we are faced with global, in particular developed market central banks, talking about tapering, talking about financial conditions that will not be as favorable as it has been. So understandably, there is some nervousness, and we are in a period of assets being repriced. So currency looked a couple of years ago relatively overvalued. Now, of course, there has been an adjustment. Stock market has adjusted, interest rates have adjusted. But real economy fundamentally is still strong. We still have a healthy banking sector. well capitalized, highly profitable, with solid asset quality. However, there is some downside risks on the back of Fed tapering, as well as the mid-December politically motivated corruption investigations. My sense is that March elections will provide clarity. It will show that political stability is not at stake, and therefore we'll go back to more business as usual, period. We have a couple of months of uncertainty. There is some local pressure, there is some local demand for hard currency, as well as reduced inflows from retail as well as institutional funds. But we can deal with that. We're letting prices adjust, and therefore I think going forward we're also going to see strong evidence of narrowing current account deficit on the back of weaker currency, softer domestic demand, as well as European Union, which is our key trading partner, is pulling out of recession.
Okay, let me pick you up on, sorry, if I can just interrupt you for a second. Yeah, just pick you up on 2 points you made. Tapering is one of them, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. The other is, and you called it this actually in that answer, you said easy money. You said there's been a time of easy money in Turkey, essentially. Are you confident that enough was actually done with that easy money? Because the criticism I've seen of a lot of emerging economies is that this money was coming in and it wasn't put to good use while it was there.
Well, as far as Turkey is concerned, our priorities have been very clear. We invested heavily in education, in human capital stock. We invested heavily in infrastructure, and these are all aimed at increasing productive capacity. As I said, we have created an economy that is a lot more resilient to shocks. We went through 2008, 2009 with no permanent damage. When there is a lot of dust in the air, understandably, there is a fair bit of volatility and weakness in markets. And Turkey is not unique. Turkey is a relatively small, open economy. So understandably, tapering and other developments globally, locally, they do affect the economy. But we do have a significant fiscal space. We can respond to shocks. As I said, banking sector is still healthy. And I think we do have a source of vulnerability, and that's large current account deficit. But on the back of currency weakness, as I said, and relatively softer domestic demand, I think there's going to be substantial adjustment in current account deficit as well.
Okay, let me ask you about that tapering. Sorry to interrupt you, Minister. You talked about tapering and you made that point a couple of times. It is a very current issue. The Governor of the Bank of India said something interesting the other day. He talked about the fact that a lot of these emerging companies actually helped the West when everything went bad. And now, maybe the West, and I guess more specifically the United States here with its tapering, should have been a bit more considerate and not just, run off and let things happen knowing what would happen with tapering. What do you think? Because in the end, the US Federal Reserve has to look after its own economy.
Well, we're not surprised that Fed is looking, and the United States is looking after their own interests. Not surprised, because US economy is gaining momentum and they care very little for the rest of the world. But I do remember during G20 summits, when the Western world, when developed world were in trouble, of course there was a very strong call for cooperation, for coordination. But there is very little evidence of that today. But this is not surprising for us. We have to make our economies more resilient, less vulnerable to this type of shocks. It's very clear emerging markets like India, Turkey have stronger fundamentals, have stronger long-term outlook. So investors will return because Turkey, India, Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, all these countries have stronger growth prospects on the back of favorable demographics, structural reforms. So I'm not worried, but temporarily, obviously, there will be some volatility, and we understand that, and we just need to respond to that.
All right, you mentioned the corruption allegations a little bit earlier. I think you called it politically motivated corruption. Tell me about that, because this type of thing, and you've just given me all sorts of reasons why the Turkish economy is in good shape and a great picture of the underlying strength, but corruption allegations, they stick. People remember that sort of thing.
You're right. I mean, we do care about rule of law. We do care about transparency, accountability. My government, since taking the office, took the office in late 2002, our #1 priority has been to reduce corruption. And if you look at Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, Turkey back in 2002 ranked 65th among 102 countries. So relatively with higher corruption perception ranking. But if you come to 2013, Turkey ranks 53rd among 177 countries. So in that sense, we've made significant progress. But by no means corruption is eliminated. In the past few years, my government, even if mayors of our own party or senior members of, let's say, bureaucracy or elsewhere, if needed, if there was a case, investigations went ahead. These investigations will also not be blocked. They will go ahead, but we can't allow a politically motivated, investigations. We can't allow unauthorized, extensive use of wiretapping, surveillance, rogue elements within the state. So that's really where we are. We've worked very hard in the last decade to build up a reputation, to improve the standards of democracy, standards of economy, and I think Turkey has been very successful. This is one chapter that obviously looks poorly, but we're going to deal with it. We're going to turn that into an opportunity. No crisis should be wasted, and these will not be wasted. We'll make the country more democratic, more transparent, and we'll move forward.
The Turkish Finance Minister Mehmet Şimşek joining us on Counting the Cost. We thank you very much for your time, sir. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, the Philippines, which has had some of its strongest growth since the 1950s. We look at how long it will actually take to trickle down to the poorest. But we mentioned Argentina earlier, so let's take a look at that too, because its economic troubles are unlikely to go away anytime soon. Government spending is fueling inflation that's now running at close to 30%. And there's not much love lost for the Argentine peso either. In fact, the US dollar is fast becoming king there. 1 in every 10 US dollars held outside of the US are owned by Argentinians. It amounts to a staggering $50 billion. More now from Daniel Schweimler in Buenos Aires.
It's not clear whether these men are carrying dollars or pesos, but this is a common sight in Buenos Aires' financial district. Whenever the country has economic problems, more and more people seek refuge in the greenback, the currency Argentines feel safe with, and it's cash only.
The most common way and easy way to save, and what all Argentines know, is the dollar. The dollar here is a social thermometer of both confidence and no confidence in the government and in the currency.
With inflation high, some independent economists put the annual rate at more than 25%, few save their money. They invest in new cars. Last year saw record sales, and in property. But transactions are strictly cash, US dollars only.
The bags were full of dollars that were from our account. The bank cashiers brought the dollars in the bags. We counted them and then proceeded to hang them over to the other side of the table, push them over, and then they counted them.
Dealing in dollars is legal, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it, since the restrictions governing trade change constantly as the government seeks to control the flow of the US currency. Many deal with black market change houses known as cuevas or caves. And these money changers are such a constant feature on the Buenos Aires landscape that they're known as arbolitos, or little trees. Everybody wants them, but just how many there are stuffed into mattresses, in safety deposit boxes, or in foreign bank accounts in Uruguay, Miami, or the Cayman Islands, nobody knows. It makes trying to read the Argentine economy extremely difficult. The uncertainty emanating from the financial district is spreading throughout the country. One of the few certainties here is the stability of the dollar.
But as we've said all along, you can't lump all emerging markets together. There are some stronger performers, like the Philippines, which in the last 2 years has seen its strongest growth since the 1950s. It's partly because of the domestic boom, International money pouring into infrastructure projects too. Even Typhoon Haiyan only slightly dented growth. But as impressive as it's all been, how long till all those at the bottom of the economic food chain actually see the benefits? Jamila Alandogan has this report from Manila.
Aiko Alano lost her job 7 months ago. She worked as a medical assistant in Manila for years. Now she's hoping to find work abroad. At this point, she's willing to go anywhere if it means she'll be able to provide a decent living for her family.
It's hard to be in the Philippines. This country is too corrupt. They're unable to solve the country's problems.
She says life is becoming desperate despite government reports that the economy is improving.
I think this is just publicity. There are still so many people like us with no place to live and no place to eat. That's why so many of us have left. If the economy is really good, then why are we all leaving?
Like Aiko Alano, millions of Filipinos continue to leave the country in search of higher paying jobs overseas. They make about 10% of the population and have now become the backbone of the country's economy.
Overseas Filipino workers send home an average of $21 billion every year. President Benigno Aquino estimates that the country will have a 6.8% growth this year. The Philippines has also been dubbed as one of the rising tiger economies in Southeast Asia. But many here are skeptical.
Most of that growth is actually coming from consumption and not investments. It's still a consumption-driven growth. Mainly, it is due to the remittances of our overseas Filipino workers that's powering consumption in the economy. That's why, despite all these high growth statistics, it has not really trickled down to the masses.
Unemployment rate in the country is now around 7%. Local surveys also show that around half of the country's population believe the quality of life has worsened. Freeing up the economy to allow more foreign investments here that can generate more jobs means amending the constitution. And it is a process that is expected to take a long time. Many Filipinos just cannot afford to wait for real reforms to take place. The need to provide for their families is urgent, they say, and they are willing to make sacrifices, even if it means living far away from home.
Well, our final word on the world economy this week goes to, appropriately, the World Bank President, Yong Kim, who spoke to Ali Velshi last week in Davos. We're going to pick up their conversation on the impact of the US Fed's pullback on its stimulus program and what that's done to the global economy, and in particular, our emerging markets.
Is there an implication to U.S. interest rates increasing for so many of the developing countries that you do work with?
Yeah, you know, if you look back to May, when Chairman Bernanke first made the announcement, we saw a bump in interest rates, and we saw lots of different things happening. You know, there were economies that saw their exchange rates drop, that saw their markets drop. And generally speaking, if you look at which countries that was, and if you look back over all developing countries, only about 38% saw their currency exchange rates drop. 62% saw them rise. Oh, wow. So it wasn't across the board, and it was the countries with known structural weaknesses, with reforms that had not been carried out, that really took the biggest hit. So we're not sure, but anywhere from a third to a half of the interest rate rise probably has already happened. And as long as the taper is smooth, and every indication suggests to us that it will be smooth, we think that the overall capital inflow to GDP ratio, it's about 4.6% now across the developing world. We think that as long as the tapering is slow, and Chairman Yellen, Chairperson Yellen has made every indication that she wants to do that, then it's going to drop from 4.6% to about 4% of GDP. Now, the concern is if it gets bumpy and we see a sharp rise in interest rates, as much as 50% of capital flows to developing countries could be gone. And so the important thing is that there's a steady hand at the wheel, and that the taper happens over a long time and is smooth. Every indication now is that that will happen, but we're watching carefully.
It looks like, generally speaking, economically, the world will be a little stronger in 2014 than it was in 2013. But for my audience that doesn't get the distinction all that well, for the part of the world that you look at as the president of the World Bank, how does 2014 look?
It looks pretty good. You know, the thing is, one of the untold stories is the fact that during the last 5 years, Africa was growing at over 5%. Mexico and many of the Latin American countries responded really quickly after the crisis of 2008. And a lot of it had to do with getting the economic fundamentals right. The macroeconomics were in shape because sometimes those countries, in some cases, those countries had gone through crises in the past. And so they had good macroeconomics, strong fundamentals, their debt to GDP ratios were manageable. And so these countries have been doing well. And from our analysis, it looks like they're going to continue to do well. The growth rates in the emerging economies is going to continue to go up. We're not seeing rates like we saw in the past, the 10% growth rates in India and China, but still very, very solid growth.
You mentioned Africa. It's interesting. Africa has become the land over which people fight for access. The Brazilians forgiving a lot of African debt, the Chinese very, very involved. It almost seems like the Western developed countries are not as involved in Africa, but there's a land grab there.
Well, I wouldn't call it a land grab, but here's what's happening. I think there's great recognition that, on the one hand, there are a lot of mineral resources that we're finding. It's seemingly everywhere, and so there's interest in the mineral resources. But there's greater interest. I think the 5+% growth over the last 5 years really surprised everybody. In 2008, if you had asked a development economist what's going to happen after the crash of the economy, everyone, I think, would have said, we're really worried about Africa. But they really managed the crisis well. And so I think that what you're seeing is an understanding that Africa is going to be a huge growth pole. In the future, people want to get in early.
Although these growth rates, and this is the way we compare growth around the world, they mean different things because people start from very different levels, different bases. So, while we're excited, and I don't know what you think of the estimate that the U.S. will grow 2.8% next year, it's growing off a very big base, we worry a little bit about China. Is it leveling off? Are they doing the right things to keep that economy growing? Because the world sort of depends on it.
Yeah. Well, it's going to, our estimate is 7.7% next year. But, China has been explicit. This administration in China, they're very committed to the reforms that they've laid out. And what are they trying to do? It's a fundamental shift away from an investment and export-oriented economy to one more focused on consumption and services. This is huge. And when the growth rate started to drop, what you could have seen is them saying, well, look, we can't do this anymore. We're going to have to go back to our old model because we've got to keep the growth numbers up. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is we've got to, and to quote them, let the market determine the distribution of resources. This is huge in the context of lower growth rates. I've met with them. I've looked them in the eye. I think they're committed to these reforms, and these reforms are necessary. They've got to bring the investment rates down. They were up to 47% investment rate, rates that are as high as we've ever seen. Mm-hmm. They know that they've got to bring that rate down, but they've got to do it slowly. They know they've got to get the consumption levels up, but they're doing the right things right now and are not panicking with the relative drop in their growth rates.
Well, let's put the brakes on this for a second and take the opportunity to have a conversation with my audience, many of whom I think are not economists and don't understand some of the nuances here. Is it the right thing to do to be encouraging consumption? I mean, some people say to me, how do we just keep on growing every year? How come the world doesn't just stop growing? I know it's possibly China's answer, and it's the answer to many places in the developing world, particularly where labor rates are low and labor wage rates are low. Is that the answer?
Well, if you want to have a growing economy, there has to be a balance. And so in China's case, there was a huge imbalance. Growth was much more driven by investment than it was by consumption. So what they're really talking about is balancing investment and consumption so that the economy can grow in a stable and healthy way. That's what we talk about at every G20 meeting, long-term, sustainable, equitable growth. It's a difficult formula to find because it's easy to get out of balance, but the fact that China is searching to find that balance, I think, is a source of great optimism for many of us.
What makes a market attractive to investment? When you go to these countries, some of them are facing remarkable income inequality, remarkable poverty, a very small middle class, a lot of wealth concentrated in a small proportion of the economy. What makes a place interesting for others to invest in?
Well, we have something called the Doing Business Report that I'm sure you're familiar with. And we don't claim to have all the answers, but the Doing Business Report has been an evolving document over time where we ask just fundamental questions like, what's the chances that your investment's going to be appropriated? How long does it take to get electricity, for example? Really fundamental basic things that have a huge impact on whether businesses invest, especially whether foreign businesses invest. And so we're going through a process now of asking the question, okay, so this is pretty good. We've gotten pretty far in terms of the ease of starting a small or medium enterprise. But now what we want to know is, do these changes in government policy, in just bureaucracy, do these changes actually lead to job creation? We don't really know that answer yet, but we want to get better and better and better at it. Now, what we hear from businesses is that our doing business report is really helpful. Just 10 very basic things, basic questions that we ask, and then we rank them. You can imagine it's controversial. People who come out low on the list don't like it very much. On the other hand, some countries like President Putin has said we want to go from, they were at 120 and we want to get into the top 20. So it's driving their policy in ways that we think are really helpful to encourage investment.
The president of the World Bank there, Yong Kim, speaking to Ali Velshi. That is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com. Click through to the program's link. You'll find the Counting the Cost page with all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. And you can get in touch. You can tweet either me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.